There is a moment in every royal drama, and British history has produced more than its fair share, when the velvet glove comes off, when the carefully choreographed language of palace spokespersons and courtly discretion gives way to something altogether more blunt, something that sounds, beneath the diplomatic veneer, remarkably like a deadline. That moment, according to multiple senior sources close to the royal household, may now have arrived. The relationship between King Charles III and his younger son, Prince Harry, the Duke of Sussex, has been deteriorating in slow motion for the better part of 5 years. It has produced a Netflix documentary. It has produced a memoir of almost forensic grievance. It has produced an Oprah interview that stopped the world for 48 hours and left the palace scrambling for responses it never quite managed to deliver convincingly. And through all of it, through the accusations, the silences, the cancelled invitations, and the public statements from Kensington and Buckingham Palace that said very little while implying quite a lot, through all of it, the door has remained, just barely, ajar. The question that analysts, royal watchers, and frankly anyone with a pulse have been asking for the past several months is this: how long can that door stay open before someone, on one side or the other, finally pushes it shut? Because what appears to be happening now is not simply another chapter in an ongoing family dispute. What appears to be happening is something with a finality to it, something that suggests the calculations inside the palace have fundamentally changed. And if those calculations have changed, if Charles has genuinely concluded that patience is no longer a strategy, but a liability, then Harry is not facing a family disagreement. He is facing a reckoning. Stay with this, because the consequences extend far beyond one family's private pain. They touch on the future of the monarchy itself, on what it means to carry the title of royal in an era that has never been more hostile to the very concept, and on whether the House of Windsor has learned anything at all from the catastrophic mismanagement of its most painful modern crisis. To understand where we are, it is necessary to understand how we arrived here. And arriving here has taken considerably longer and involved considerably more missteps on all sides than the official narrative tends to acknowledge. When Harry and Meghan announced their decision to step back from senior royal duties in January 2020, the move that tabloids immediately branded Megxit, with all the contempt that suffix implies, the palace's response was, by any objective measure, a masterclass in institutional panic dressed up as dignified calm. Charles, sources suggest, was genuinely blindsided. Not because he hadn't seen the signs. The tension had been visible to anyone paying attention since at least 2018. But because he had consistently underestimated the depth of his younger son's disillusionment. There is a particular kind of institutional blindness that affects those who have lived inside a system their entire lives. The rules of the palace are so deeply internalized, so fundamentally woven into the fabric of how its inhabitants understand the world, that genuine departure from those rules becomes almost conceptually impossible to imagine. Charles, who has spent his entire existence inside this system, waiting, preparing, performing, could not quite believe that someone born into it would choose to leave. Harry not only chose to leave, he chose to explain, at extraordinary length and with considerable precision, exactly why. The memoir, the documentary, the interviews. What struck many observers was not simply the content, though the content was remarkable enough, but the methodology. Harry did not retreat into a grieved silence. He did not, as so many royal figures before him have done, suffer with the stoic dignity that the institution demands, and that the British public has been conditioned to admire. He talked. He kept talking. And in talking, he committed the one sin the palace finds truly unforgivable. He made the private public, and he did it on his own terms. Now, here is where it gets genuinely interesting. Because the palace's response to all of this talking has been, strategically speaking, a sequence of decisions that range from questionable to frankly baffling. The conventional wisdom, repeated by royal correspondents with the confidence of people who have spent many years being briefed by palace sources, is that Charles has consistently attempted to leave the door open, that he has maintained a father's hope, however battered, that reconciliation remains possible, that the invitations to the coronation, to various private occasions, represent genuine attempts to maintain connection despite everything. This reading is not wrong, exactly, but it is incomplete. What it misses is the institutional dimension. Because Charles is not simply a father managing a difficult relationship with his son, he is a king managing a constitutional asset. And the monarchy, whatever romanticized notions we may hold about it, is fundamentally an institutional asset. Its value depends on public perception. Its survival depends on its ability to project unity, purpose, and relevance to a public that is, in significant portions, no longer convinced any of those things apply. Harry, by contrast, has built an entire post-royal identity on the proposition that the institution is broken, that its cultures are toxic, that it failed his wife in ways that were not accidental, but systemic. This is not merely a family complaint. It is a direct challenge to the legitimacy of everything Charles has spent his entire life working to inherit and now, finally, occupies. You cannot be simultaneously the king who validates the monarchy's values and the king who warmly embraces the son who has spent 3 years publicly describing those values as harmful. These two positions are not reconcilable, and it is the growing recognition of their irreconcilability, sources suggest, that has shifted the internal calculation. Think about it this way. Every time Harry gives an interview, and he continues to give interviews, continues to maintain a public profile built explicitly on his distance from and criticism of the royal family, the palace faces the same impossible question. Engage, and you amplify. Ignore, and you appear weak. Reconcile publicly, and you appear to validate. Maintain distance, and the narrative of family breakdown continues. There is no good option here. And when institutions face a situation in which there is no good option, they tend, eventually, to choose the option that at least ends the uncertainty. Let us talk about what ending the uncertainty might actually mean in practical terms. Because this is where the stakes become concrete rather than theoretical. Harry currently holds the title of Duke of Sussex. He and Meghan hold the style of His and Her Royal Highness, though they do not use those titles in their American public life in any formal sense. Archie and Lilibet hold the titles of Prince and Princess, a consequence of the automatic elevation that came with Charles's accession to the throne. These are not merely honorifics. They are, in various ways, commercially valuable, legally significant, and institutionally complicated. The question of what a formal rupture would look like, what it would actually involve, procedurally and constitutionally, is one that royal legal experts have been quietly examining for some time. And the answers are less straightforward than the headlines suggest. Stripping titles requires specific action. it is not simply a matter of royal displeasure. It requires letters patent. It requires a degree of institutional formality that, crucially, makes the act itself a public event of some magnitude, which creates yet another dilemma. Any formal action Charles might take to definitively sever the connection would itself become a story, a large story, exactly the kind of story the palace has been desperately trying to avoid. Which is why, if the reporting is accurate, the approach being taken is not primarily about titles at all. It is about something simultaneously less dramatic and more fundamental. It is about property, about financial arrangements, about the quiet, unglamorous infrastructure of royal life that nobody writes Netflix documentaries about, but that underpins everything else. Frogmore Cottage, the Windsor residence from which Harry and Meghan were asked to vacate following the publication of Spare, was, in retrospect, a significant signal. It was a removal of a tangible, physical connection, a taking back of something that had been given. And it happened with relatively little public drama, precisely because it was transactional rather than ceremonial. The logic, if the current reports are accurate, is the same. The pressure is not theatrical, it is structural. And structural pressure, applied quietly and consistently, tends to be considerably more effective than public ultimatums. Now here is the uncomfortable question that nobody in the palace's orbit particularly wants to answer. If this strategy, quiet structural pressure, gradual withdrawal of institutional support, the slow closing of doors rather than the dramatic slamming of them, if this strategy is so sensible, so measured, so effective, why has it taken 5 years to deploy it? Because that is what the historical record actually shows. 5 years of mixed signals. 5 years of invitations extended and then awkwardly retracted or allowed to expire without follow-up. 5 years of palace briefings that simultaneously suggested Harry was welcome back and made the conditions for his return sound essentially impossible. 5 years of a communications strategy so incoherent that it managed to generate maximum publicity while achieving minimum clarity. The late Queen managed Harry's departure with considerably more instinctive skill. Her response, warm in personal tone, firm in institutional boundary, struck a balance that left Harry with little to publicly complain about, even as it clearly defined the terms of his new existence. Charles has never quite replicated that balance, and the reason, most analysts suggest, is that Charles is dealing with this not merely as a monarch, but as a wounded father. And wounded fathers, even ones wearing crowns, are not always at their strategic best. What appears to have changed, and this is significant, is that the institutional voice has begun to override the paternal one. That the advisors and courtiers who think in decades rather than in emotional responses have gained the upper hand in internal deliberations. That the question being asked inside Buckingham Palace is no longer, how do we bring Harry home, but rather, how do we manage Harry's permanent absence in a way that minimizes ongoing damage to the crown? These are very different questions, and they lead to very different answers. There is a historical parallel worth drawing here, and it is one that the palace itself will find uncomfortable precisely because it is so apt. The Duke of Windsor, Edward VIII, the king who abdicated in 1936 for love of an American divorcee and spent the remainder of his very long life in a gilded exile that satisfied nobody, spent decades in a state of suspended institutional animation. He wanted recognition. He wanted his wife given the title she had been denied. He wanted, fundamentally, to be welcomed back into the family he had left while retaining the freedom that leaving had given him. He wanted, in other words, to have it both ways. The palace's response to Windsor's demands was neither cruel nor generous. It was simply impervious. He was kept at arm's length with the minimum courtesy necessary to avoid public scandal, denied the formal rehabilitation he craved, and gradually reduced from a figure of international glamour to a historical footnote whose primary legacy was the constitutional crisis his departure had resolved. Harry has read enough royal history to know this story. One might assume, given this knowledge, that he has actively worked to avoid its repetition in his own life. And in some respects he has. He has been far more vocal, far more publicly assertive, far more aggressive in controlling his own narrative than the Duke of Windsor ever was. But the structural dynamic is remarkably similar. A royal who has left demanding terms for re-engagement that the institution cannot accept without undermining itself. An institution that finds it easier to manage absence than to negotiate return. And a slow, grinding process of mutual disengagement in which the emotional cost is borne primarily by the person outside the walls, not the institution within them. The Duke of Windsor never came home. Harry has perhaps been calculating that he is different enough, more modern, more media-savvy, more connected to a global audience that genuinely cares about what he says, to force a different outcome. That calculation may be about to be tested. Let us consider for a moment what Harry's options actually look like from Montecito, California, in the spring of 2026. The Archwell Foundation has faced significant challenges. The Netflix deal, while lucrative by most people's standards, has produced content that has performed respectably without generating the cultural impact that might justify its reported price tag. The memoir, Spare, sold in extraordinary numbers, but has receded from public conversation with a speed that suggests it functioned more as a one-time event than as a lasting reputational foundation. Meghan's return to social media and lifestyle content has generated genuine engagement, but it has also drawn the couple back into a celebrity media ecosystem that is notably less sympathetic than the one they anticipated finding when they left. The Sussex brand, to use the commercial language that the couple have themselves embraced, is at a pivotal moment. It requires either significant new content, new projects, new ventures, new narratives, or it risks the slow drift into irrelevance that has claimed so many royal-adjacent celebrities before them. Princess Eugenie can testify to how quickly public interest in royal adjacency can evaporate when you are no longer producing either drama or genuine cultural product. And this is where the institutional connection, however attenuated, however contentious, retains its value. Because the thing about being a duke is that it is permanent in a way that being a Netflix talent is not. The title confers a status that no streaming deal can replicate. The royal connection, however fraught, keeps Harry in a category of one. Remove it, and he becomes something more ordinary. Something more vulnerable to the ordinary laws of celebrity gravity. Charles and the advisors around him are not unaware of this calculus, which raises a question worth sitting with. Is what appears to be a hardening of the palace's position genuinely about principle? About protecting the institution? About the understandable frustration of a father and a king who has repeatedly extended olive branches only to see them incorporated into the next media project? Or is it, at least in part, a recognition that the leverage, such as it is, runs primarily in one direction, and that exercising that leverage now, before any further erosion occurs, is strategically rational? Both things can be true simultaneously, and in royal politics, They usually are. The British public's relationship with this entire saga deserves its own examination, because it has evolved in ways that neither Harry nor the palace entirely predicted. In the immediate aftermath of the Oprah interview, polling suggested a public genuinely divided. Significant portions of the British public found Harry and Meghan's allegations credible and concerning. Significant portions found their conduct, particularly the choice of timing, the choice of platform, the choice to litigate family grievances on American television, disloyal in a way that transcended their specific complaints. What has happened since, however, is something more nuanced than simple polarization. Public fatigue is real. The appetite for another round of Sussex drama, another interview, another revelation, another palace response that appears drafted by committee and lands with all the warmth of a legal notice, is measurably lower than it was in 2021. Younger British audiences, the very demographic the monarchy is most anxious to retain, have moved on to other concerns entirely. This fatigue cuts both ways. It reduces the audience for Harry's continued criticism of the institution, but it also reduces public sympathy for institutional action against him. Nobody particularly wants to watch a crown strip titles from a young family, regardless of how diplomatically complicated that family has made themselves. Which is precisely why the approach, if reports are accurate, is incremental rather than dramatic. The palace has learned, painfully, expensively, too slowly, that dramatic confrontations with Harry tend to produce headlines that ultimately benefit Harry more than the crown. The goal, it would appear, is not a public rupture. The goal is a quiet resolution that allows both sides to occupy their respective positions without the ongoing friction of unresolved relationship generating perpetual news cycles. Here is what the next 30 days, or whatever time frame the internal conversations have actually produced, will likely determine. It will not determine whether Harry and Charles reconcile. That question, in any meaningful emotional sense, may already have been answered by the accumulated weight of everything that has been said and published and performed over the past 5 years. Genuine reconciliation, the kind where trust is rebuilt and wounds are tended, does not happen on institutional timelines or under institutional pressure. What it will determine is the formal structure of their separation. Whether Harry retains enough of the institutional scaffolding, the titles, the technical royal status, the relationship with the firm that allows him to describe himself as working within its orbit even while living 6,000 miles from it, to continue his current positioning, or whether that scaffolding is finally, formally, removed. If it is removed, the consequences for Harry are significant, but not catastrophic. He is wealthy. He is globally recognized. He has a platform and a partner, and a family and a life that, by most objective measures, is functioning adequately, even if it is not producing the legacy he imagined when he made his choices in 2020. The consequences for the monarchy are harder to predict. There is an argument, made quietly but seriously by constitutional scholars, that a formal, clean break is actually healthier for the institution than the current ambiguity. That the ongoing question of Harry's status, the permanent low-level drama of his half-in, half-out position, is more corrosive to royal dignity than a definitive resolution would be. That you cannot modernize an institution while it is perpetually relitigating its most publicized family breakdown. And then there is the argument on the other side, that any formal action against Harry and Meghan plays directly into their narrative, that it validates every claim they have made about institutional coldness and institutional cruelty. that it hands them a final chapter that writes itself and will inevitably be told somewhere, in some format, to a substantial audience. Charles is navigating between these arguments, and the fact that navigating between them has taken 5 years and appears to be producing something that looks, at last, like a decision, tells you something important about how genuinely difficult this particular dilemma is. It is worth stepping back at this point and asking the broader question, the one that outlasts the specific drama of Harry and Charles and all the accumulated grievances between them. What does this moment reveal about the monarchy as an institution? Because the House of Windsor's handling of the Sussex situation has been, by any serious analytical assessment, a prolonged exercise in institutional failure. Not moral failure. The rights and wrongs of individual positions within this family are genuinely contested and genuinely complicated. But institutional failure, in the sense that the monarchy's primary job, the thing it exists to do above all else, is to project unity, stability, and purposeful continuity. It has not done that. For 5 years, the most prominent story about the British royal family has been a story of fracture, of accusation and counter-accusation, of briefings and counter-briefings, of children born into a family that cannot agree on the terms of its own membership. This is not what the institution is for. This is, in fact, the precise opposite of what the institution is for. Charles, who waited longer than any heir in British history for his moment, who spent decades preparing and preparing and preparing, who arrived at the throne carrying the scars of one catastrophic marriage and the fragile happiness of a second, did not need this to be his legacy. He needs to be the king who restored dignity to an institution badly damaged by the 1990s, who guided it through the grief of his mother's death, who modernized it sufficiently to remain relevant without so revolutionizing it as to lose its essential character. The Sussex situation threatens to consume that agenda. Every month that it continues unresolved is a month in which Charles's historical reputation is being written, at least partially, in terms of his failure to manage his own family. And historical reputations, once written, are remarkably resistant to revision. So where does this leave us? What can we actually say with confidence about where this extraordinary, exhausting, apparently interminable family drama is heading? We can say this. The signals are clearer now than they have been at any point in the past 5 years that the palace has concluded the status quo is untenable. That maintaining the fiction of an open door, while quietly doing nothing to actually open it, is producing more institutional damage than whatever consequences flow from a clearer resolution. We can say that Harry's position, the position of a man who has left an institution while retaining its labels, criticized it while trading on its cachet, and maintained a public identity built on his distance from something whose connection he has never fully relinquished, is inherently unstable. And inherently unstable positions eventually resolve, either toward reconciliation or toward rupture, but toward something more definitive than perpetual ambiguity. We can say that the person with most to gain from a clean resolution is, counterintuitively, Harry himself. Not in the short term. A formal separation from the institution would generate headlines that would be personally and professionally uncomfortable. But in the longer term, the freedom to build an identity entirely unencumbered by the unresolved question of his royal status
might prove more valuable than the status itself. And we can say, finally, that whatever happens in the coming weeks and months, it will be watched by the British public, by the global audience that Harry and Meghan have spent 5 years cultivating, by constitutional scholars curious about precedent, by historians already beginning to write the first drafts of this chapter, and, most significantly, by a younger generation of royals, William, Catherine, their children, for whom the outcome of this particular family drama will shape the institution they will one day inherit.
Because that is, in the end, what this is really about. Not Harry's titles, not Charles's patience, not Meghan's Netflix deal, or the contents of a memoir, or the specifics of whatever conversations have taken place behind palace walls. It is about what kind of institution the British monarchy chooses to be in the 21st century. Whether it can resolve its most visible internal contradiction in a way that demonstrates the judgment, the grace, and the institutional confidence that its survival ultimately requires. The House of Windsor has navigated crises before. It has lost kings, buried scandals, survived divorces and abdications, and accusations that would have finished less entrenched institutions entirely. It has a remarkable, almost biological capacity for institutional survival that should never be underestimated. But survival and flourishing are different things. And the monarchy's ability to flourish, to be not merely tolerated, but genuinely valued by a public that has other things to think about, depends on its ability to project the kind of settled, purposeful confidence that 5 years of Sussex drama has comprehensively disrupted. Charles has 30 years of watching his mother get this right. He has watched her absorb crises that would have broken lesser figures and emerge with her dignity, and the institution's dignity, essentially intact. He knows what getting it right looks like. He knows, presumably, what getting it wrong looks like, too. The question is whether knowing is enough, whether the combination of father and king that he necessarily is can, at this late stage, find a resolution that serves both roles without catastrophically failing either. The clock, if the reports are accurate, is running. And this particular family, in this particular institution, has a long history of running out of time before it was quite ready to decide.